I'm the director of the McCullen Center here at Villanova University's Charles Widger School of Law. The McCullen Center seeks to bring a diversity of views to Villanova and provide a distinctive students across college boundaries to discuss issues related to constitutional liberty, economic freedom, the place of religion in society, and civil discourse on challenging topics. Since it was launched in the fall of 2017, we've hosted 34 events with an outreach to approximately 5,000 attendees in our virtual and in-person programs. Our most recent event in December was a conversation with former South Carolina Governor Nikki Haley, and she just announced she's running for president. So Archbishop, if you want to make any announcements like that, you're welcome to. Thank you to the many people who helped to bring about this event: Melanie Dudley, the Assistant Director and Program Manager of the McCullen Center, Nicole Garofano, the Law School's Director of Events, and the many administrative support, development, IT, facilities, and communication staff here at Villanova who've been so generous with their assistance in this program. Before introducing our speaker, I would like to turn the podium over to the president of Villanova University, Father Peter Donahue, on his birthday, to say a word of welcome.
Michael Moreland, former faculty member in the law school. Thank you very much. Archbishop, it is an honor for Villanova to welcome you here. For the past year, I think this community has lifted you and your people up in prayer. It is something that I think so many of us have struggled to try to understand what is happening in your part of the world, or between Russia and Ukraine, and the things that are going on and what is happening to your people. And I want you to know how much we support your efforts and what you are doing. And we continue to pray for you. And that's, unfortunately, that's about all we can do other than send things over, because we have done that as well. But just recently, we came into the great fortune of having a contact with the Catholic University in Ukraine that you began. And due to one of our employees here, who you know very well, I think we just are at the point of signing an MOU with the university so that Villanova University and the Ukrainian Catholic University will have a relationship with each other. So thank you for that. And we are honored, as I said, to have you, and we continue to pray for you and ask you to pray for us. Welcome.
Archbishop Borys Gudziak is the Metropolitan Archbishop of Philadelphia of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, the president of the Ukrainian Catholic University, and the highest-ranking Ukrainian Catholic prelate in the United States. The son of Ukrainian immigrants, Archbishop Gudziak was born in Syracuse, New York, and earned his bachelor's degree in philosophy and biology from Syracuse University. In addition to studying theology in Rome at the Holy Sofia College and Pontifical Urban University, he earned a doctorate in Slavic and Byzantine cultural history from Harvard. Archbishop Gudziak founded the Institute of Church History in Ukraine in 1992 and subsequently served as vice rector and then rector of the Theological Academy there. This organization formed the basis of the Ukrainian Catholic University, where Archbishop Gudziak now serves as president. Prior to his appointment as Archbishop of Philadelphia of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church, Archbishop Gudziak served as Bishop of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church in France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Luxembourg, and Switzerland. He is also a member of the Permanent Synod of the Ukrainian Greek Catholic Church. He is the author of numerous articles and scholarly works, especially in church history, including the book Crisis and Reform, the Kievan Metropolitanate, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the Genesis of the Union of Brest, Harvard University Press. He speaks English, Ukrainian, Italian, Polish, French, Russian, and German. Archbishop Gudziak has been recognized with various awards and distinctions internationally. He has received honorary doctorates from the University of Notre Dame, where he was the commencement speaker last year, the Catholic University of America, St. Charles Borromeo Seminary, and his alma mater, Syracuse. In 2021, Pope Francis named him a member of the Dicastery for Communication, and in 2022, he started a term as chairman of the Committee on Domestic Justice and Human Development of the U.S. Conference of Catholic Bishops, and recently he received the Catholic Faith Network Award of Excellence. Please join me in welcoming to Villanova Archbishop Borys Gudziak.
Dear Father Peter, dear friends, thank you. Thank you for this invitation, and thank you for the warm welcome. It's an honor to be here, on your birthday. I'm honored that you're taking birthday time to be at this lecture. That maybe we can call it an encounter, because I hope that's what it will be. I'd like to share, a few insights with you, and then maybe we can have some questions and answers. I don't know if I knew that this MOU was in the works, but I'm thrilled to know today. And, sometimes these things can be formal, and they don't touch too many people at the university other than one aficionado or two. But I'd like today to encourage all of you, many of you, or those whom you teach or study with, to consider going with your mind, with your studies, with your research, and even with your body to the place where global change is occurring, to the epicenter of global change. Right now, if we look back at the world a year ago, the Russian invasion has affected every single human being. Russian aggression has raised food prices and energy prices globally. It has caused a lot of disruption. But the Ukrainian resistance to this invasion, the unexpected, almost miraculous resistance, has shaken many things up in a positive way. My chief of staff, a French woman in Paris when I was bishop there, once said, "You've got all these young priests coming from Ukraine with their wives and children. They really want something. A lot of our kids, they don't know what they want. They, get an education, get a job, but have a good, comfortable life and not much deeper. Your people really want something." I was in Paris in 2013-14 during the Revolution of Dignity, which was called the Euromaidan, Euro Revolution, as it started. And people in Paris were saying, all this dedication to this abstract European Union, people are willing to die for the European flag. Today, the European Union has a completely revived sense of being. There's value in a union that has preserved peace for 75 years after devastating wars. We had a president that spent much time undermining NATO. And not only the American president. President Macron said NATO is brain dead. Today, NATO is stronger than ever, with new countries joining. At least Finland and Sweden, and maybe Ukraine and Georgia will be next. A defensive alliance that was the guarantor of that peace for 75 years in Europe and across the Atlantic. Today, people are realizing that Ukraine actually feeds 400 million people, potentially can feed 600 million people. And disrupting the grain supplies from Ukraine will cause starvation in North Africa, the Middle East. The ecology is changing. Germans are slow to change their policies, and I'll criticize the Germans maybe more sharply later if we get to it. But once they decide to do something, they get it done. And so having a rather cynical energy policy, cheap energy from Russia, cheap labor from China, fosters our economy, principles don't matter. The Germans have decided they have to go sustainable. And when Germany does that, they're going to lead the world. And the ecology is going to change. The dangers will be confronted more seriously. The energy policy, economy, politics, military relationships. But most importantly, and I was kind of thinking over this year, why such attention to this war? There's 20 wars in the world. People are being killed. There's more people killed in the drug wars in Mexico than in Ukraine. There's Sudan, Ethiopia, every continent. We can just enumerate them. Yemen. What is it here? Americans like an underdog. Is it just that Ukrainians are an underdog? Well, it is a biblical story, isn't it, with David standing up to Goliath. And there's a certain moral clarity. Ukraine was like a lamb. We priests use the word Lamb of God. The Lord became vulnerable for us, to become one of us, to sit next to us, to work with us as a carpenter, to be part of our life. Vulnerability is a great part of the divine plan. And so peacemakers and popes and other dreamers talk about nuclear disarmament. But you rarely hear these advocates for peace mention the fact that nuclear disarmament has already happened. That Ukraine, along with Kazakhstan and Belarus in 1994, set a precedent. They gave up their nuclear arms unilaterally. I had to remind Pope Francis of this. I had an hour and a half with him on August 26th. People don't think about it. People in Ukraine wanted peace. People in Ukraine wanted democracy, prosperity, human dignity, freedom, the rule of law. Yes, there was great corruption, but they were fighting it. One manifestation after another. In 1990, still in Soviet Ukraine, students led a hunger strike on the granite of Kyiv and brought down the Soviet prime minister of the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic. At the same time, there was a quiet change that most people in the world didn't notice. The ethnically cleansed Muslim Tatars of Crimea, who in 1944, 45, 46 were deported en masse, totally, to Central Asia, were welcomed back into Ukraine. In 2004, there was the Orange Revolution. Maybe you remember the poisoned presidential candidate, the falsified elections, standing on the freezing main square of the country. It was 17 days when all the cameras of the world were riveted in this incredible solidarity. At that point, the Ukrainian freedom fighters, advocates of democracy, etc., made a mistake that they acknowledged and repented. Because they kind of said, okay, we won the election, and let's let the officials decide. The maturity of the civil society was still in a early stage. A democracy, a mature civil society, has to have the responsibility and engagement of everybody. We would maybe call that subsidiarity, one of the main principles of Catholic social doctrine. So the next time things came to a head in 213, 214, a much broader representation of the Ukrainian population participated in what was called the Revolution of Dignity. The pretext was that the president, who had promised to foster something that had been in the programs of one president after another, association with the European Union, free travel for young people across the borders, reneged on that under Putin's pressure and enticement. He bought him. And they came out onto the square. They were beaten. And adults, workers, artists, professors, mothers, grandmothers said, we're not going to take this. And millions came onto the square of Kyiv, other towns in the country and throughout the world. In Kyiv, 100 people were shot in broad daylight often, with the cameras running. There's a documentary which shows when John, Joe, Mary, and others were shot and where it happened. One of my colleagues, a young professor of history, was among them, Bogdan Suchanek. If you read Serhiy Plukhy's History of Ukraine, Gateway to Europe, you'll see a special profile precisely about this young historian at a Catholic university who at 26 gave up his life. And that led to the expulsion of the president. The president had to flee because he knew that it's like hell could not contain Christ, the positive force of life. So this positive context could not contain the pus of corruption, of violence, of authoritarianism. And President Yanukovych left, and Putin really got scared. Because the darkness fears the light. It wasn't NATO and its expansion that threatened Putin. NATO had no intention to invade in that direction, and we can see to this very day how the boxer is told to fight without one arm. You know, Ukrainians can't shoot into Russia as the whole country is being bombed and hit by missiles, with raining barrages of, of artillery fire falling on all kinds of cities. There was no intention of Ukraine that gave up its nuclear arsenal and reduced its army from 900,000 to 150,000, of which only 15,000 were battle ready in 214. No intention, no danger. And the Kissingers and what's the guy in Chicago? Remind me. Mearsheimer's. They're wrong. They're wrong. They're misguided. Putin was afraid of freedom. Putin was afraid of freedom of religion, which does not exist in Russia. Putin was afraid of freedom of the press, which no longer exists in Russia. There's 500,000 Ukrainian Catholics in Russia, 500,000. That's 10 times as many as we have going to our churches in the U.S. We have 4 dioceses and 200 parishes. There's not a single Ukrainian Catholic parish that has a legal existence in Russia, that is registered as such. There's not a single Ukrainian language school for the 4 million Ukrainians in Russia. you know what happened to the oligarchs. You know the social contract. You can steal, you can manipulate, but you have to support me. And if you don't, I'll take the richest one of you and put him in prison. And so step by step, over 20 years, lamenting the greatest tragedy of the 20th century, which was for Putin, the demise of the Soviet Union. A man who at the age of 16 wanted to join the KGB even before that was possible. He had to wait a few years. A man who has imbibed that culture and done everything to promote it for 50 years, decided he's going to attack Ukraine on February 27th, 2014. And 2 weeks later, annex Crimea. That's when the war began. That's when people began to die. That's when volunteers went to the front. That's when students at the Ukrainian Catholic University made freeze-dried borscht. And grandmothers sewed socks for the soldiers. That's when the army of 15,000 battle-ready troops slowly began growing to become what is the strongest fighting force today in free Europe. NATO needs Ukraine because NATO needs strong defensive forces. The danger was growing. The freedom was not put down. And this virus, much more dangerous than COVID, could spread across the border into Russia. So when the US, in a chaotic manner, decided to pull out of Afghanistan, Putin made his decision. I don't know which day, I don't know exactly which month. He didn't make it on February 23rd, 2022. He had been amassing troops in the spring of 2021. And in the fall, it became evident. And President Bush and the British were telling President Zelensky, prepare for the attack. And Zelensky says, I have different information. It's not going to happen. Which was his line until the day before the invasion. Zelensky's become an incredible leader. Unless he does something terrible, he will go down into history. But you know why he's a leader? Because he realized he had to follow. He followed the people. Zelensky was a rather superficial, money-making, B-class comedian. It wasn't very subtle comedy. It was slapstick. He was not on the Maidans that I reiterated to you. Clearly, he had little choice. He could flee like the Afghan president. And he did. He said, I'm here. We're here. We're staying here. He followed the witness of so many who had already given their lives over the previous 8 years. And from day to day, in a way that nobody could predict, and nobody still can, somehow, despite the odds, Ukraine stands. Everywhere I went in Ukraine, I've been there 6 times, and I visited 10 other countries contacting refugees. Not a single person said we need to give up. There are, I'm sure, people that are saying it costs too much. The deaths are too numerous. The trauma cannot be borne. I'm sure there are. I haven't met them. because Ukrainians understand that it is do or die. In the 20th century, upward to 15 million Ukrainians were killed or died in a natural death between 1914 and 1950. It's more than 1,000 people a day. Every day for 36 years. There were 2 world wars. There were all kinds of purges. There was the artificial famine planned from Moscow, which at least 4 million people died. Only during World War II, 7 million inhabitants of what is Ukraine were killed, including probably at least 1.5 million Jews. There were all kinds of purges. Poles were deported. Tatars. At least 400,000 Western Ukrainians after World War II were sent to Siberia. My relatives among them. And as it always happens when there's a Russian occupation of Ukraine, the Ukrainian Catholic Church gets suffocated. In 1945-46, it happened rather quickly. All the bishops were arrested. And any priest that refused to pass to the Russian Orthodox Church was sent to Siberia along with his wife and children, because most priests were married. And they went, hundreds of them, as witnesses. Witnesses of the truth. What is a witness? A witness is somebody that doesn't do the cost-benefit analysis as the main criteria for a decision. A witness says, this is the truth, and I will witness to this truth, despite the cost, maybe no matter what the cost. So, throughout the 20th century, in this context of totalitarian genocide, wave after wave, Ukrainians have been making conclusions. The Ukrainian Catholics are a minority, about 8%. But on those Maidans that I enumerated, there were a plurality, if not a majority. Because they had not endured the same kind of desolation in the 20s and 30s that the Orthodox Church. The Orthodox Church of the Russian Empire had 100 bishops. In 1914, by 1939, 4 were left. The Russian Orthodox Church endured great suffering. But in 1942, when Stalin was desperately losing the war with Hitler, he decided to revive the Russian Orthodox Church as another influence in defending the motherland. Since then, the Russian Orthodox Church ended up being in a subservient relationship of profound collaboration. And today we have the symptoms of that. We have a patriarch, a Christian patriarch, who in the 21st century, when all Christian confessions are repenting and lamenting the role of their churches in imperialism and colonialism and slavery, a Christian patriarch is using jihadist language to justify war crimes. This is a quote, if you fulfill your duty, and if you are killed there in Ukraine, all your sins will be forgiven. It's the language of the suicide bombers. He says it, many clergy, bishops say it, and not a single of the 300 bishops has spoken out against the war. Not even liberal ones who have been guests at this university, like Eleanor. Not a word. Not one word. Only 300 of the 40,000 priests and deacons in the Russian Orthodox Church have signed a petition against the war. That's less than 1%. And most of those are outside of Russia. Collaboration is a very difficult thing. Totalitarianism and standing up to it is very difficult. But there were these forces, these sacrifices made in Ukraine. My mother's sister died in the resistance. My father's family was deported to Siberia. They paid an incredible price for maintaining their identity. And they had a church leadership that in doses, in understandable, popular formulas, presented Catholic social doctrine. Divinely instituted human dignity, solidarity, subsidiarity, and the common good. He doesn't know it, but President Zelensky has been taking a crash course in Catholic social doctrine. I'll try to explain it to him if I get the chance. I say it often, so maybe he'll hear it sometime. But I guess he's getting an intuition, because 5 weeks ago he went to visit the Ukrainian Catholic University. It's a school of 2,200 students, only 28 years old since its restart. Lviv, where it is located in western Ukraine, is like San Francisco or Philly or Boston. Not the big economic and political centers, but important cultural cities with many institutions of higher learning. Lviv has 120,000 students. UCU has 2,200. Zelensky came, and he came early, and he spent an hour with the rector, the president. And I don't know, Father Peter, if we can imagine this as clergy, but Father Prach, Bodan Prach, the rector, got a call a week later, and President Zelensky asked him to be Minister of Education for the country. Well, both of us and he are, protected by canon law. We can't accept that kind of law. But that is if we preach and live the gospel, if we are ready to witness, if we are ready to sacrifice, if we are even ready to die for the truth, it will give fruit. It might take some time. The sacrifice of our Lord, the martyrdom of the apostles, did not change too many minds immediately. It took 300 years before Christianity became legal. There are more Catholics in Philadelphia than there were in the Roman Empire in the year 250. So the epicenter of global change is not only an epicenter of political, military, diplomatic, energy, food policy change. It is a place that either consciously or subconsciously is attracting the subconscious or subconscious attention of millions and billions around the world. Because at a time when we're a little bit lost, we live in what is called the postmodern period. Postmodern means we're kind of describing ourselves reactively. There's something behind us, but we're not sure where we're going. We're not there anymore, but what is it? Where are we going? We're deconstructing a lot of things. Wholesale. Many things that need deconstruction. We have structures like racism that need to be deconstructed. Certain social and economic relations. How can we have so many murders in Chicago, in this country, such poverty, such ghettos? Not everything received from the founding fathers is perfect. But the deconstruction is now wholesale. There's facts, but of course now we have alternative facts. There's your view of the truth, but there's my view of the truth, and there's a billion others. You know, Derrida and the philosophers here can explain this much better. And simple Ukrainians are saying, not so fast, buddy. Not so fast. There's good and there's evil. There's truth and there's lies. And I'm willing to risk my life for it. Father Peter, I have students that have given their life. I met with widows who are now thinking about how to raise their children without their husbands. I know so many that have volunteered and are on that front. And they all are thanking Americans. They're thanking you for your prayer, for your advocacy, and for your help. Defensive, economic, and humanitarian. Because what Ukrainians are saying today is there's a deep pathology in Russian culture. These are strong words. It's a culture that across the board, is saying we're an empire. And if we're not, we have to reconstitute it. 70% of the Russian population supports the war. 80%, last week's poll, supports Putin. I gave you the statistics on the Russian Orthodox Church. 700 university rectors, university presidents signed a statement in support of this war. 700. There are the courageous few. 10 or 20,000 have been arrested. Some are in prison, some have just had their hands slapped, and now they're silenced. There's a deep pathology in Russian culture. It's not enough to have 11 time zones. It's not enough to be 28 times as big as Ukraine. And you know what it is? It's a giant expression and conglomeration of what sin is. Because what is the life that the Lord has created us for? God created Adam and Eve in this kind of gesture. It's a gesture of giving. And God, who in the Father, with the Son and the Holy Spirit live the gift of interpersonal relationship, create us, God creates us in God's image and likeness so we can live as givers. And God says one thing, just don't take that fruit because you will die. Don't grab. That gesture is the quality of sin. It's to me, for me, I, me, bare-chested on a tank. It's not only Putin. There's politicians that are focused on the first person all over the place. It can happen in the kitchen. You know, it's my kitchen. Get out of my kitchen. This war, like any war, is a conglomeration of all sin. Rape is being used now as a weapon of terror. Serial rape, execution, torture in the occupied territory. And Ukrainians, having the history of the genocide in the 20th century and seeing what is happening in the occupied territory, are saying it's it. Peru's not going to be a colony of Spain, Algeria of France. Canada's not going to join the empire over which the sun never sets. all these empires, European empires, have given up, never without a fight. They've given up, and now slowly we say, you know, it wasn't so good. Not everything in Western civilization and its imposition, even of the faith, was in keeping with God's will. But here you have a church, you have the cultural elite, educational elite, and general population supporting a colonial war. And Ukrainians are saying no. Blacks are not going to be slaves of whites, and Ukrainians are not going to be part of an empire which negates their language, their culture, their religion, their freedom, their self-determination. We'll see how it ends. I have great faith. I think the Lord will receive the sacrifice of this lamb. This lamb which has had to pick up a sword, reluctantly. But I think it's the depth of this challenge and the ultimate nature of the sacrifice that is being made that is mesmerizing the world. And I hope that will add to the change, to the inspiration. And I think it's happening. That's why you've invited me here. It's not me, it's them. And in their name, I want to thank you.
Questions. The Archbishop needs to go to Washington, so he needs to get on a plane and leave.
Another event tonight.
But we have until the top of the hour for any questions anybody has.
Please.
I have read some who argue that maybe 10, 15 years ago, if there were an election in the eastern part of Ukraine, is that all called the Donbass?
The Donbass is 3 regions of Ukraine out of 25.
Okay.
I don't want to say states, but that might be.
And at any rate, they argued that if there were an election, maybe a majority of that population would have wanted to become Russian. Is that true?
Well, I have somewhere, it might take me a few seconds to find it. You're speaking about the hypothetical. I will tell you about the actual. In 1991, there was a referendum about independence. Every single region voted for Ukrainian independence. It was 90 point, is this working? Can you hear me anyway?
Yes.
90.3% of the population voted for independence. There was a majority in every single region, Donbass including. Donetsk, in Crimea it was 54% for Ukrainian independence. 83% in Donetsk region. And 83% in the Luhansk region. Lower than the national average, but 83% is pretty overwhelming. So that's not a hypothetical, that's the referendum in 1991. Which brought, by the way, that's what brought down the Soviet Union. It was December 1st, 1991, and that was because the country proclaimed independence in August, after the coup in Moscow. But that was a decision of the parliament. And then it was taken to the people, which is what you want. A few months later, December 1st, there was this vote, and December 25th, Gorbachev announced the dissolution of the Soviet Union.
And when there was war in that region, all the soldiers without uniforms, without badges, I take it, they were sent from Russia. Is that the case?
Well, the soldiers without badges and uniforms that was in Crimea, they were all sent from Russia. They were called the Little Green Men. And Putin, like he would tell many about many things, says, no, we don't have people there. Until a few years later said, well, yeah, they were all our people. You cannot believe that man. He said there would be no invasion until February 21st. He had that diatribe where, after which, there could be no question which way things were going, but he kept saying there's no invasion. And this has been the weakness of President Bush, President Obama, the devastating weakness of President Trump. They believed in one way or another. If you remember, Bush said, I looked him in the eye, saw his soul, and realized he's an honest man. President Obama ridiculed Mitch Romney when he said, Russia will be our greatest geopolitical challenge. He said, Mitch, your social policy is in the 50s, your economics are in the 30s, and your geopolitics are in the Cold War. It was a great line. He won the election, but he was wrong. And now, the world has to pick up the pieces. And then President Trump said, basically, my 17, what do you call it? Not security agencies, but intelligence agencies. 17 American intelligence agencies are wrong. Mr. Putin is right. I think things will still emerge on that front, but Berlusconi on the far right and I'm sorry, the Italian who was also the head of the European Union. No, it's also two syllables in the 2000s. These are guys on opposite ends of the political spectrum, but both of them are telephone friends of Putin. Romano Prodi. Romano Prodi, his circle was late February, a year ago. They thought, we can call Putin, let's see if we can try to convince him not to do this. Putin has been on this track nonstop for his whole presidency. There's a naivete, even at highest levels of church leadership. But that's a whole separate question. We're filming, so.
Thank you, Archbishop, first for your informative and powerful lecture. You mentioned Pope Francis. What do you say to those who argue that nonviolent resistance is the answer, that nonviolent resistance is more coherent with the demands of the gospel and can even perhaps be more effective? Now, I want to be clear, that's not my position.
Yes.
I'm a Catholic theologian who believes in the viability of the just works of tradition and its importance, and I think we see that in Ukraine. But there are many, including, I think, Pope Francis, who want us to move away from this framework. What do you say to this?
Well, I think nonviolence resistance is very effective in maybe a majority of situations. I read with great fascination writings or biographies of Dorothy Day, for example, who was very radical. I met with Chicago Catholic worker movement people a few days ago. But even those Chicago Catholic worker movement said, on this one, given a situation like Ukraine, we don't agree with our founders. It's kind of simple at a certain level. You know, if you go into the subway and you see some young guy beating up on an old lady, I'm going to go and jump the guy, get him off her. I'm not going to say, listen, nonviolently, I'm going to try to convince you not to beat, rape, or whatever, rob this woman. Ultimately, some things are that simple. And the Pope has said, he's actually spoken very, very clearly. I mean, he said to my colleague, a vice rector of the university, who came to see him because there were various ambiguous statements. He said, Holy Father, can we defend ourselves? And the answer was, and it's published, was not only do people have to defend themselves, but if you have a situation when you're defending innocence and you don't do it, it's like suicide. So Pope Francis, you know, says there's a big weapons problem, and the Holy See at certain points has said to the Western countries, don't send weapons. But even there's been an evolution over this year, and I say that as an intimate witness of the process. After one of these very complex statements on August 24th, which happened to be Ukrainian Independence Day, I just happened to be in Rome on a retreat. The next day I was asked to come on the 26th, and I had an hour and a half with the Holy Father. And I said, Holy Father, it's wrong. NATO is not the reason. If Ukraine was admitted to NATO in 2008, we wouldn't have this war. And, you know, usually priests don't or bishops don't speak like that to the Pope. I have great love for Pope Francis. I think many of the things that he is modeling are prophetic. Synodality, for example, is a way that my diocese lived. We had big synods twice a year. It was a regular thing, not an extraordinary thing. And it makes a difference. But it's difficult. There are many countries that can't see the right in Ukraine because Ukraine is being supported by the West, especially the US, and the gringo for us is enemy number one. So much of South America and Africa, are not actively involved. Although last week, 141 countries in the world basically voted condemning the war. That was done early, but also saying that Russia needs to get out. It's a terrible thing, war. And you can't say anything more strongly than giving up your nuclear weapons and reducing your army, 80%. That's the attitude, that is the stance taken by the country, the society. But now it's facing destruction. It has no choice. It has absolute clarity about it. Last week, the polls in Ukraine said 95% of Ukrainians believe they're going to win this war. Now, what win means is, a question. But they can't lose.
Time for one more question.
Archbishop, could you, in 5 minutes, give us some insight into the establishment, Russian Orthodox Church, and their support for the state under Putin and for this war?
Well, it's, to give a subtle answer would take more than 5 minutes, and, I've spoken about some things. it's a matter for tears. Every society needs its church. And the Russian Orthodox Church is a very important part of Russian culture, Russian society. And it is the prime channel through which people who live on that territory can come to know Jesus Christ. It has great riches, liturgical practices, haunting music, mystical iconography. But the basic problem is, can we really walk with Jesus as we are called to do right now on Lent and in Holy Week? God goes down. It's a descent. It's a stripping. And that primal, original sin reflex of the grab is often geared, or always geared actually, for the self-build-up. So it's not this, it's this. And there's an enticement, as George Florovsky would say, prelest, for some kind of hegemony. And when the government gives you millions, for example, 70 million euros to build a Russian Orthodox church in the center of Paris. It happened before my eyes. 70 million. Will that be a house of God where the root of Jesus going down is the main message? Maybe you need the widow's mite, many mites put together to build the church. The wedding of the church with power, it's always corrosive. Sergei Chapnin, I don't know if you know that name. He was the head of the publications department of the Moscow Patriarchate for many years, but about 6 years ago he quit, and he's now at Fordham University at the Orthodox Study Center. You've heard of that center, maybe. You might consider inviting him. You might look up his open letter to Orthodox bishops, published about 2 weeks ago. He says, brothers, I'm not writing to all of you, I'm writing to each of you. I know many of you. What you are doing, your silence, even worse, your advocacy, has nothing to do with the gospel. It's an illusion. And not in that letter, but in my house, he said, this is a dedicated Russian patriot, and he's now a refugee in exile. He said, I fear that Russia and the Russian church have to hit bottom, fall apart, before there can be reform. Now the real politique people will say, well, you can't have that. You can't have that. You can't have the Soviet Union fall apart, as George Bush Sr. said in Kyiv at the beginning of August of 1991. Ukrainians, beware your suicidal nationalism. It was called the Chicken Kyiv speech. Because we got to keep it all together. All those nukes have to be. And 3 weeks later, the place, shattered and ultimately fell apart after that referendum that we talked about. It's all very complex. It's not easy. It's, we say a prayer during Lent with a bow, the prayer of St. Ephrem, where you say, help me see my sins and not judge my brother. So forgive me if, things that I've said have been judgmental. In a university, we're supposed to talk about some of the facts. Some of the facts we can't talk about in university settings these days. But anyway, it's a tragedy. But the Lord is present, the Lord is working, and I think Pope Francis is recognizing that sometimes the church needs to be humiliated, or it needs to undergo humiliation to see the truth. I think we're seeing that in the North American Catholic Church for a certain set of reasons. There are other reasons that this will have to happen for a revival of authentic Russian Orthodoxy.
Thank you again.